Hey guys, so this is my demo of my Iron Mass skeleton build using Fleshcrafter. We're going to do a Drox real quick and Awakener 8 to show off the build a little bit, and then I'll go over how it works.
Must have time to gather my will. My mana is spent.
I've killed countless thousands. What's one more? Crush the intruder!
And that's it.
Your strength is the...
So let's go over the build a little bit. So as you can see, I'm using the Iron Mass, which gives your skeletons triple damage with hits, and they use this weapon if you've hit recently. And we use Fleshcrafter with that, with skeletons using the skeletons that have anomalous. We use Divergent Multi-Strike, Awakened Ally Focus, anomalous minion damage. This is actually from an old build, so an awakened minion damage would be better, but it's not necessary. Predator support, and then awakened elemental damage with attacks. And we just use a high energy shield helmet with minion life for Animate Guardian and Raise Spectre, along with meat shield and elemental army. And that way we have a Diabolist that casts Enfeeble, we have a They of Toll for reduced damage taken, and then we have an Arena Master for damage buff. Just another high ES shield, high ES boots, and then the rest of our gear is just additional energy shield resists and then stats to fill out our requirements for the Iron Mass. And we use a Triad Grip with Awakened Generosity, Smite, Anger, and Wrath, so we can get as much added damage into the build as possible because we're scaling off this triple damage hit as well as the high added damage bonus from skeletons themselves. In the belt slot we use Darkness Enthroned with Ghastly Eye Jewels. Now this is just one example of what you can get. The thing that's nice about this build is that you can use any kind of added minion damage, and as long as you get the other two stats with it, it's going to be good for the build. So these two are both, one was added cold and the other was added lightning, but yeah, you throw those in there and then you're doing pretty good damage. But you get a pretty good damage bonus from that. And then just regular utility flasks for ES. And then now let's look at the tree. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, I also have crafted aspect of the spider on this ring. So our final count for auras is anger, wrath, aspect of the spider, and discipline. With Val Discipline whenever we need it. And I guess I should go over the other links too. We have a carrying golem with feeding frenzy and minion life to keep them alive. And we have just some, like, we have flame dash. We have our flesh offering, which is divergent to get the additional 10% increased attack speed. Flame dash for movement, convocation, and then we have a leap slam with fortify. This is for mapping when you need to get like throw your skeletons on a pack, and then you want to teleport into it, but you don't want to die off. Even with this much ES, you can get drilled down pretty quick if you're not paying attention. So the idea is you throw this down and then you leap slam into the target.
I must have time
your
to
minions
gather
are
my
attacking
will.
by the time they come up from their stuns that they've been hit by with your leap slam, and you get fortify on top of that. So it's a pretty good defensive layer. It's really the only major defensive layer we've added to the build, minus HP. But now let's look at the build. So we are Guardian because we're trying to circumvent the fact that we're using such a low ES chest, and because of the Iron Mass, the way it works, minion levels for our raised skeleton, our summoned skeletons, aren't going to be as effective. So they actually won't scale the damage because the skeletons use this sword to do their damage. So they no longer scale with minion levels for damage. So it makes sense to do something other than just a necromancer. And so Guardian was the next best choice, because he gets this added ES. We get about 500 to 700 additional ES from that one node alone, which is pretty good. We get Time of Need to get some extra life regen. We use Radiant Crusade and Unwavering Crusade for some extra minion damage and some buffs and debuffs to the enemy, like Intimidate. And then the rest of the tree, we just kind of path through the obvious minion nodes we get on our way. We also are grabbing all of the aura nodes that we can that are within reach, within reason. Going CI, and then we go in here, we drill in, we get this ES cluster, we get this mana ES hybrid cluster, and we get the +1 to skeletons here and here. And then the next thing we work on is our cluster jewels. So our cluster jewels are really not super expensive. It's always going to be expensive getting a 9 passive skill large cluster jewel for minion damage or less. So I'd recommend just going with 9 and not worrying about 8, because you don't need 8. But the passives you want for this, so you want to try and get an increased attack and cast speed for minions, and then the important thing is to get Rotten Claws along with Call of the Slaughter, because that moves Call of the Slaughter down into this node area instead of being up in this quadrant. So you can save some points doing it that way. So both of my cluster jewels are very similar in this fact. I actually got lucky finding this one because I had additional ES on it too, which is pretty nice. Our medium jewels are these aura jewels that have either self-control, first among equals, or self-control, actually, where is it? Or self-control and stalwart commander. And then these are pretty expensive. They're by no means necessary. The only mod on there that you really need to have is self-control, because we have to use 3 of them to get a 0 mana reservation on our discipline, so that we can run all of our auras and aspect of the spider and have enough to still cast. So this node actually, this medium cluster jewel actually, it can be replaced with something else. But the idea is that you get first among equals, self-control on one of your nodes, and then the other 2 are stalwart commanders, so you can buff up your discipline up more and more, so you can get a higher ES pool. The entire basically thing you're chasing for with this build on the tree is to try and get as much defense as you can, because once you fill in the core items for your minions, they do so much damage that really you don't have to worry too much about any more on the tree. Like, of course you can get these 2 nodes on each side and they'll add a hefty, I mean, about 15% more damage, but you're already doing, and I can show you this guy's in the POB, but you're doing about 23 million DPS on single targets with multi-strike on this build, which is pretty comfortable to do anything and you just burn it down extremely fast. I've done, I don't know how many Uber Zero runs Deathless now, and it's perfectly, like, at the current state of this build, I think it's perfectly viable for hardcore. You just have to be smart. All the times I've died, it's from either doing a really crazy map, and then jumping into a pack and not being ready for it and getting stunned, or forgetting that I have Val Discipline up and not using it. So this is very much a hardcore viable build at this point in time, and while it does have a high ceiling cost, it doesn't cost a lot to start. I think when I started transferring this build over, I ended up having like 7k ES, which is not a lot, but as you go, as you pay more and more for higher tier like ES gear, you can start getting really good shit like this, for example, and the shield. And the shield adds a ton of ES because we've allocated the Arcane Guardian, or Guarding node, because it gives an extra huge bonus to energy shield from your shields. And it's relatively cheap to craft on your amulets. And like I said before, we could do Ravenous Horde, but it's not necessary. We already get Onslaught for our minions because of Guardian, and really any other minion-based nodes. Like, the thing that's interesting too about the Iron Mass is that your Skeletal Warriors, your triple damage, right? Because double damage and triple damage are the same kind of stat, any kind of double damage you get in your tree no longer does anything, because you're already tripling their damage. So that's one of the nice things too about this build, is because we don't have to make our medium cluster jewels all of renewals in minion life clustering. So it allows us to get a lot more defense than you would normally expect for a minion build. I know usually when I see skeleton builds that are able to do what, like 26 million, half a million, or like 50 million DPS, they're usually teetering around the 5k life mark, or like 5 to 6k life, which is not really a lot. It's kind of you feel kind of squishy. With this build, I feel pretty tanky. I can't run into mobs obviously and just take a lot of hits, but I can definitely I can survive an Uber Elder single flame blast some of the time, or Uber Zeri flame blast, but Uber Elder and its Cirrus and all of those boss fights are extremely easy on this build because you do so much damage, and as long as you're not getting one shot, you don't have to worry about it. But let me finish this tree and I'll talk about the Guardian. The other things we get are, we have a Fortress Covenant, and the corruption you're wanting to look for here is a reduced reservation of mana. You use a 2 dust, same story, reduced reservation of mana. That mod is actually really cheap. I've picked this one up for only a couple chaos. There were more, but people weren't responding. So you have a 2 dust here, and then you have your Fortress Covenant. You also pick up an energy from within to get a bunch of extra ES here. Over here you have another 2 dust. This one actually got some curse immunity to silence, so that's pretty nice. And then another 2 dust here for reduced mana reservation. And actually, I misread this one. So yeah, this is my from dust that you're required to have. You need to have at least room for one of these in your tree, since it's just huge quality of life, because you just throw these guys down, and because of the 2 called slaughter nodes we have, their movement speed is extremely high, and combine that with Flesh Offering, and they're dashing around the map even without Feeding Frenzy. they're moving extremely quickly, so they clear things pretty fast with melee splash inside. So one other thing I wanted to talk about was my guardian. So the thing that's weird about this chest is that it makes your minions convert their life to chaos, or their life to energy shield based on chaos. So for things like a Animate Guardian, this can be problematic, right? Because he is losing a huge portion of his life with a base amount of 20 chaos res to energy shield, and so you'd expect him to be extremely not as tanky as he would be normally, right? Well, if you completely change him to ES and use something like Geoffrey's Sanctuary as his chest piece, combined with the Oak Shield that gives like 3% life regen and base, and then 3% when you're on low life, and a bunch of extra life. If you combine those two, you get this. This is the tankiest Animate Guardian I've ever had. I've ran him through Uber Ziri. He's tanked double flame blasts. He's tanked Uber Elder fights, and none of my life-based versions of this build were able to withstand that kind of damage. He sits pretty comfortably. I don't know if when you convert 98% of his life to energy shield, if he then starts to count as on low life. I would assume not, but the fact of the matter is he's still extremely tanky based on what I've put in him now. So what I use with my Animate Guardian is I have the Crown of the Tyrant, obviously, as you can see, and then I use the Sign of the Sin Eater because as an ES build, you're going to be hit by ailments left and right, and it gets really frustrating for me because I'm not really great with my flask uptime. I'm terrible at it. It's usually why I play minion builds, because a lot of other builds require that. Well, with the Animate Guardian, you use the Sign of the Sin Eater on him, which has a stat called that says that all nearby allies who have ailments on them apply to you instead, which is pretty good, because then that means that as long as my Animate Guardian is next to me and alive, I cannot be shocked, frozen, or ignited. I can still be bled, and I can still be stunned, but that's why I have this. I have redundancy in my flasks for curse immunity, and I have some bleed immunity, and yeah, I have a lot of curse immunity, and I have stun immunity with Kira's determination, so that I'm covering all my bases with that. So yeah, that's pretty much the build from the in-game version of it. Now, if I want to go over here and look at our path of building, you can see the actual numbers. So right now we're sitting at, this is with, I've actually imported this, so this is with my personal gear that I'm sitting on right now, and we're sitting at about 22.3 million DPS per skeleton with 10 skeletons against Cirrus, because we ignore elemental resistances with Fleshcrafter. And with all of these buffs up that are reliably up, I've seen a couple builds where they have summon skeletons and they include frenzy charges with like Carnage Chieftains and stuff like that, and I don't think that's really realistic, because most skeleton builds are resummoning over each other every few seconds, and even with blood magic and those chieftains, they're not going to be pumping out enough frenzy charges for you to even hit those ceilings. But so this is a very reasonable POB for how much damage I'm actually doing in game, and we're not POB warrioring over here. But yeah, as you can see, this is the same tree and everything else. Gear's the same. To include the Animate Guardian in here, I have the added lightning damage, and the Arena Master I have as a Spectre. It's hard to kind of tell how much raw increased damage he adds over total, but when that is active, I jump all the way up to 2.5 million DPS for my skeletons when his buff is active, which is a lot more consistently on skeletons than the buff from frenzy charges, because even if they oversummon or they just summon, they immediately have the full stack of this increased attack speed. But yeah, that's pretty much the build.
I must
tell me what you guys think in the comments.
To gather my will.